Hey everyone, it's Mr. Miles. I'm just going to give you a brief mini lesson, basically to substitute for the lecture that I would have given on dark romanticism, just to kind of give you an overview of what romanticism looks like when it is dark, what these major dark romantic writers that are notable in American literature, what they are known for, what they're all about. So, really, the way this week is going to work is because you are going to read a short story by Edgar Allan Poe, and then break it down, do a project on it. You're going to come back from spring break. We're going to revisit that story, whichever one you picked. You're going to then read The Raven, a poem by Edgar Allan Poe. Then you are going to read Nathaniel Hawthorne, who is the other kind of major dark romantic writer. And so the dark romantics are where we're going to kind of camp out for a little bit. It is important to kind of know who they are, what they're about, especially as we're going to see them in contrast, in direct kind of opposition to the transcendentalists. Okay, because the dark romantics and the transcendentalists represent kind of two different streams of thought when it comes to American lit in this time period, specifically Romanticism. So we're going to look at those in detail, okay? But right now, let's focus on the dark romantics. So this is a really detailed presentation. I'm not going to read every single slide or anything like that. I'm just going to kind of give you the mile high overview of what to know about dark romantics, okay? Specifically what you need to know going into Edgar Allan Poe. So this is going to kind of function as both an overview of the Dark Romantics as well as Edgar Allan Poe specifically, and what to know before you read him. Okay, so Romanticism is the first major literary movement in America. It kind of created a whole host of subgenres. The kind of the two main sub genres, the two main sub streams that it kind of splintered off into are transcendentalism, which we will talk about more after the Dark Romantics, but also the Dark Romantics, the Dark Romanticism. Okay. So first off, what is Romanticism? You can't understand Dark Romanticism if you don't understand Romanticism. Well, if you remember, Romantics are all about individuality, intuition, imagination, creativity. Going into nature, finding inspiration from nature, seeking the sublime, communing with nature, and finding either God through nature, or if you're a transcendentalist, finding God in nature. And so it's kind of those sorts of ideas are very common, very prevalent in the Romantics. They're all about creativity. They're all about doing stuff that is fictional and kind of fantastic. And if they want to incorporate the supernatural, they're totally welcome to. Um, but that's kind of what the Romantics are about. And so the Dark Romantics, if you can probably guess by the name, they take that to another level. And it does not 50 Shades of Grey, Dark Romantic, not the romantic I'm talking about. So they take basically a glass half empty approach to Romanticism. They basically focus on the darkness, they focus on the evil and the sin that is inherent within humanity. And these are the three major American dark romantic writers. Okay. From left to right, it's Edgar Allan Poe, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Herman Melville. Okay. Um, and those are their names. Okay. So the guy on the left, Edgar Allan Poe, he's the one whose story you're going to be reading this week. So what makes dark romanticism dark? So basically, romantic writers were glass half full. They were very optimistic. They essentially saw the universe as one long arc that bends toward justice, that eventually things work out in the end. The dark romantics were much more pessimistic, okay? They, didn't necessarily believe that if you do good things, eventually you'll get your reward. And if you do bad things, you'll get your just reward. They believe that sometimes sin conquered. They believe that sometimes bad people won in the end. And they also wanted to explore the idea that we could all be bad, that we could all be evil, that this idea of good people versus bad people is not as cut and dry as some people would like to make it out to be, that we are all capable of doing wicked, evil things if we are either pushed to that point or if circumstances surrounding us kind of make us feel like it's more acceptable to do that sort of thing, or we put on a front of goodness while on the inside we're just wicked and rotten to the core. So the dark romantics are really more interested in exploring those kinds of things, and especially sin, especially the capacity for any person to sin. Um, and if you're a Christian, you've probably heard the term original sin, which is the basically from Adam and Eve eating the fruit in the garden, they became tainted with sin. And so all future generations are therefore tainted with sin. So when you're born, you are born in sin, right? And so everybody is capable of sinning, right? And so what does that look like? Even people who are good, or pastors, or people who you would think like mothers and nurses and doctors and people who you would think would be good, moral, upstanding, upright people, they can still sin and be terrible people. So that's what the dark romantics are really interested in figuring out. And so these are kind of like the three uh, big things about dark romantics: symbolism, but in a creepy way, obviously. So, like the skull represents death, the fact that you're going to die. And so, a lot of characters will look at skeletons and they'll be reminded of their own mortality, things like that. Horrific themes: the fact that you are going to die, the fact that good people are sinners and that we're all sinners and that we can all do terrible, wicked, awful things. And then psychological effects of guilt and sin. So, like, if you are a sinner, how does that affect you psychologically? How does that affect you if you're hiding your sin? If you've done terrible things, but you're trying to keep it from the world because you want to appear to be a better person than you really are deep down on the inside, right? So, these are the kinds of things that the dark romantics really wanted to get down to the bottom of. And you can look at this on your own time. It's talking about symbolism. Um, oops, I kind of skipped ahead there, didn't I? Let me go back to where I was. So, for instance, a red rose might symbolize something beautiful like love and passion for a romantic, but for a dark romantic, you might find something like a rose having thorns represent something that is beautiful on the outside, but secretly sinister or injurious, right? Um, okay. Another thing to think about when it comes to the dark romantics is also, and we'll see it when we talk about Melville here in a minute, is about nature, right? Because the romantics are all about nature, and they're all about loving nature and being in touch with nature, and oh, nature's so beautiful. I'm going to find the sublime in nature. Da, da, da. But you also have to bear in mind that nature can be dark and nature can be evil. Or if not evil, it can be dangerous. I can go into a jungle and find, all sorts of inspiration to write a poem or whatever, but I can also get eaten by a tiger. So nature can also be dark to the dark romantics. And so they also kind of subverted and twisted those ideas as well. Um, so, other things to think about: the horror of evil, the capacity for all of us to be evil or do wicked things or evil things at least. Um, what is human nature, right? What is our nature to do good or to do bad? If no one was around and you had the option to do good things versus doing bad things, no one's going to catch you. What would you do? And so that's kind of the things that the dark romantics really just wanted to explore. All right. So let's kind of get down to the specifics here. And if you're looking for modern films that kind of embody the dark romantic mindset, I do kind of like um, thinking about it like, what's a movie that kind of embodies this? Like American Psycho is all about this psycho's inner brain working, right? Like, how does his mind work, right? That's much more dark romantic. It's not just straight up horror, like slasher, blood guts everywhere. It's more about the inner workings of this person who is broken, who is full of sin and evil, if you want to call it that, or at least just inner darkness that he's trying to wrestle with, and in some cases, gives into. right? Not all of us conquer the inner darkness in our souls. Many of us give in or succumb to the inner darkness. And so those are the stories that Dark Romantics wanted to write. Okay, so speaking of dark nature, Herman Melville. Herman Melville is mostly known for one big book called Moby Dick. And Moby Dick, if you know anything about, is about a hunt for a whale, a giant white whale called Moby Dick. Um, but it's about so much more than just about hunting for a whale. It's really a tale about revenge because you have a character here named Captain Ahab who has one leg because the whale Moby Dick took off his other leg, and he's pursuing this whale, and he will sacrifice anything to get to kill that whale and have his revenge. And he winds up basically killing his entire crew just so that he can have a chance to kill this whale, um, which is obviously not a very nice thing to do. And so this inner darkness inside Ahab essentially takes over his entire being. And that's really something Melville wanted to explore, like this idea of revenge at all costs, this idea of what does it matter if I lose everything, but I get this one satisfaction. Um, and so that's essentially what the gist of Moby Dick is all about and what Melville was interested in. Um, Next up is Nathaniel Hawthorne. Hawthorne, we are going to read a story of his called The Minister's Black Veil. The Honors American Lit students over the summer read a book of his called The Scarlet Letter, which, if you haven't read The Scarlet Letter, you should. It's an interesting book. It's really good. The language can get kind of hard to get into at first, but once you get used to the language, like anything else, you're like, okay, I've got this. It's easy. Um, but we're going to read a story of his called The Minister's Black Veil. And what Hawthorne wanted to focus on, if Melville was all about nature is dark or nature can be dark, and the darkness inside of mankind kind of spilling out into the world around us, Hawthorne was more concerned about appearances versus the internal wickedness of people. He was very concerned with hypocrisy and hypocrites, and the fact that so many people go around on a day-to-day basis looking and acting like they have so much together, like everything is perfect, while on the inside they are sad, miserable cretins. So you can imagine what Hawthorne would think about like Instagram today, like the fact that everybody's posting all these beautiful filters and Instagram stories of them playing with their dog and going and having ice cream or going to the Cheesecake Factory or all this stuff, and on the inside they're sad, miserable, broken sinners, right? And so Hawthorne was very fascinated with this idea of being a hypocrite. What does that mean? What does that look like? And so that's kind of his focus in a lot of his writings. Okay, and so we'll see that when we read The Minister's Black Veil when you get back from spring break. Okay, but those guys are followers in the footsteps of this man right here. Edgar Allan Poe lived a short life. He died when he was 40, um, drunk, alone in a gutter, and that's where they found him, and that's where he died. Yet, in the 40 years he was alive, he was perhaps one of the most influential writers in world history. And I say world history, not just American history, because if you like detective stories or murder mysteries, Edgar Allan Poe invented them. If you like science fiction, sci fi stuff, Edgar Allan Poe wrote arguably some of the first science fiction that we have. So, yes, he's mainly known for his horror. He's mainly known for his darker stories, ghost stories, things like that. But he invented a lot of things when it comes to literature. He is kind of the father of American literature. Like we talk about Washington Irving as the father of American literature, but Edgar Allan Poe is really what helped us create an identity in terms of our literature. And I mean, obviously, I have a poster of the guy in my classroom. I love Edgar Allan Poe, but it's not just me and my love for Edgar Allan Poe speaking here. It's the truth because Edgar Allan Poe is so important. And after Edgar Allan Poe, American writers were inspired to do things that were really different. from what the British were doing over in Europe. And they were like, yeah, we can do this. We can make our own literature that has our own distinctive flair to it. Um, and we don't have to try to like imitate whatever the British people are doing over there. So that's why Edgar Allan Poe is so important. Um, One thing that when you're doing your Edgar Allan Poe hyperdoc that you need to be thinking about is Edgar Allan Poe he was a literary critic in addition to being a writer. So he wrote reviews of books and things like that in newspapers and magazines. And so he was a big fan of whatever you write, it needed to achieve something he called the singular effect, the one effect. Okay. If I sit down to read a horror story, what is the one effect I should probably get out of it? I should probably be scared, right? If I am reading a comedic story or a satire, what's the one effect? Well, I should probably chuckle or laugh or find it amusing, right? So he believed that you should have short stories that achieve a singular effect. Okay. And for the Poe stories that you're going to be reading, obviously the singular effect, the mood of the piece he's going to be shooting for is he's going to be shooting for it to be dark and sinister and spooky. And he's going to be shooting for those effects as he reads or as you read his stories. And so what you're going to be looking out for as you read is be looking for the diction he uses. Like, what word choice does Poe use that accentuates the mood of darkness and fear and gloom and evil or foreboding, right? Um, you could say the house was empty, or you could say uh, the house was abandoned and stood like a grinning skull at the top of a hill. Well, obviously, the word choice he's using there makes this house seems really spooky, right? So, how does Poe achieve that singular effect in his stories? Okay, that's something to think about. Um, Another thing he talks about is tragedy, personal tragedy. Poe lived a very sad life. In addition to living a very short life, he married someone, and she very quickly died of tuberculosis right after that, which was a very common disease back then, and it was a very sad disease because you die by basically the blood filling up in your lungs and you're coughing up blood all the time. And so it's a very sad, very graphic and gory, lurid kind of disease. And so he had to deal with that, the love of his life had, he was hardly married to her before she died in this horrendous way. And so, a lot of his stories deal with depression. They deal with loss and they deal with death and what the people who are left behind, the grieving ones, what does that do to them? And many of Poe's works are allegories as well. Out of the three stories that you'll get to pick in your hyperdoc to do, um, probably the one that is the most allegorical is the Mask of the Red Death. But you have elements of symbolism in every one of those stories. But probably the one that's most obviously an allegory for something is Mask of the Red Death. All right, and so all that stuff's about the Raven, which is something a poem that we are going to read when you get back from spring break. Um, Alienation, loneliness, psychological horror, and then all that's about the fall of the House of Usher, which we will not read in this class, but you can read on your own time. It's a really good story. It's a bit longer than some of the ones that we're going to be reading, but so that's essentially Edgar Allan Poe in a nutshell, and the Dark Romantics and what they're all about. So, in a nutshell, to sum it all up, what are the Dark Romantics? The Dark Romantics are romantics in the sense that they want to write about nature, the natural world. But rather than look at it as a lens to which to see God, they look at it as a lens through which darkness might poke through. They want to write about the human experience, human nature, and what it means to be a person, right? To be creative, to have inspiration. But rather than being inspired by great, good, awesome things, they are inspired by dark things like the loss of a beautiful woman. They are inspired by dark things like grief or hypocrisy. And they want to explore those things and how it affects the psychology of people who deal with grief or deal with loss or deal with madness. Okay. Um, and so that's what the Dark Romantics are all about. Um, and then Edgar Allan Poe, his thing is, how do I do that? How do I achieve a singular effect? How do I target a specific sensation or feeling that I want my reader to experience? Okay. One thing that I like to call Edgar Allan Poe is he's like the master of mood. Okay. So if tone is the author's attitude toward his subject, mood is how the author wants the reader to feel. So when it comes to mood, Edgar Allan Poe is unmatched at evoking a mood and making you feel spooked or suspenseful or things like that. So that's really his thing. And so, whatever story that you pick in the Hyperdoc, be on the lookout for that. Be on the lookout for his singular effect.